office is unravelling, saying support for Scottish independence has been steadily falling since the Brexit vote. I'm joined by the American journalist Beth Gardner, who's written for the New York Times and Guardian, amongst many others, and of course the political editor of the FT, George Parker. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
And shall we start with that article in the Guardian, Martin Kettle? It's an interesting thesis, the idea that as we leave the European Union and Donald Trump starts barking from the other side of the Atlantic, this is the point at which we might again start to focus on our European partners.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting thesis, and at the moment when Theresa May is preparing for what's increasingly looking like a fairly ugly divorce from Europe, you would expect under sort of normal circumstances that London would be looking towards its, its other ally to the west, to the United States. But I think what Martin Kettle is getting at here, and which certainly seems to be the case to me, is that, transatlantic relationships are going to be, I think, unpredictable and messy in the coming years, like everything else that Donald Trump touches. This is an American president who is very iffy about his commitment to NATO and the transatlantic alliance more broadly. Obviously, that's been a real linchpin of global security for many decades now, flirting very heavily with Putin and the authoritarianism of Russia. I think this may put Theresa May and her government in quite an uncomfortable position, and it may make for some pretty unstable times.
I think people, when they saw Trump coming, they thought this was going to herald a populist tide across Europe. I think the point Martin Kettle's making is that Trump is a very American politician.
Yeah, certainly true.
Berlusconi, I suppose, is the closest we've ever had in Europe to this sort of the plutocratic businessman sort of populist figure. But it's interesting, I think, that what we could see over the course of this year is, I think, Angela Merkel being re-elected in Germany, possibly Emmanuel Macron in France, who's kind of the nearest thing France has to Tony Blair, Theresa May, a very mainstream politician in Britain. And in fact, at the end of 2017, we could see this populist president in America, but much more mainstream politicians ruling the roost in Europe.
Still, quite a nuanced leader from the Daily Mail. As they point out, President Obama said we were straight to the back of the queue when it came to sorting out a trade deal. Donald Trump has been rather more forthcoming, saying, don't worry, we can sort this out quickly. I mean, even the Daily Mail suggesting that they have some significant reservations about the president-elect, even if they don't name them.
Indeed, yeah. And I think, that's indicative of the fact that he is not a normal politician, and we're not in normal times anymore, I don't think. This is someone who really, I think, it's pretty questionable how he regards our, sort of the most fundamental sort of tenets of our constitutional democracy in the United States. Things like freedom of the press, things like freedom of religion. Obviously, something like that Access Hollywood tape where he was boasting about groping women. That's not a partisan issue. In the United States so far, we have now seen the parties kind of line up along traditional lines, Republicans backing him. But we'll see whether that lasts as he sort of, continues to sort of break the china.
Well, also the weight of responsibility of the office. I mean, the Mirror's leader suggesting that Donald Trump may surprise us. I mean, it's a question, isn't it, George, of just how much, as we saw during the election campaign, he says things that he knows that his audience wants to hear. Now that he's in the Oval Office, whether he says the opposite.
Well, I'm sure what we'll see in his inauguration speech today is a call for unity. He'll surprise people with his statesmanship and the sort of emollient tone. I guess the question is, does he really mean it? Was the rhetoric on the campaign trail something he really means, in which case we've got a lot to be worried about. Just on the Mail's point, they are obsessed about the fact that President Obama had contempt, as they put it, for Britain.
Yes.
And that Donald Trump, because of his Scottish antecedents, the connections with the golf clubs in Scotland, will be a much more pro-British president. I think Obama had a cool relationship with many world leaders, including with Britain. I don't think it was contempt for Britain, but certainly there's a view in the Mail that there could be this revival of the Maggie, Ronald Reagan duo in the 1980s.
I mean, there is a suggestion of a superficiality to Donald Trump. You take a look at the Telegraph cartoon, there's a hint of it there. Can we do business with someone who is so obvious, so widely considered to be lightweight in certain areas? I mean, clearly he's a successful businessman.
Yeah, I think the thing to understand about Trump, first of all, I don't think he's as successful as he likes to portray himself as. He's been through multiple bankruptcies.
Many millionaires and billionaires have.
Has left his partners and his contractors very often sort of holding the bag. But as far as whether Britain can do business with him, I think, in the reaction this week to the Michael Gove interview and Trump's comments about wanting to do a deal very quickly with Britain on trade, you know, I think it's very easy to make the mistake, because this would be the normal assumption, that, you know, listen to what he says and, you know, that's what he means, and that's how it's going to be. Donald Trump is not, this is not a president, an incoming president, where there's been a policy process that's led to a decision and it's going to be followed by an implementation. This is a guy who just talks off the top of his head, often with very little information, and I think it remains to be seen what the follow-through is going to be. Obviously, trade negotiations are very complex. There are issues between the US and the UK that have made those deals difficult in the past.
I think the trade deal is important, but obviously with Britain distancing itself from the EU, the other strategic relationship is with America. So there'll be a huge effort to be in with Donald Trump, but it's a dangerous relationship because Theresa May's got to negotiate Brexit. And if it looks like she's being used by Donald Trump as some kind of wedge into the European project, some sort of part of some Anglo-Saxon plot from the White House to break up the European Union, that's a dangerous position for herself to get into.
Still, underneath the cartoon in the Telegraph, Fraser Nelson suggests that we have seen an evolution in Theresa May's politics. I mean, what is your assessment of that? Hasn't she simply made some mistakes that she's performed U-turns on?
I think so. I think if you go back to the speech she was making in that very short Tory leadership contest where she was talking about, you know, taming capitalism, imposing pay caps, more protectionism. Now we're starting to see more of global Theresa May. And she's trying to ride two horses at once, it seems to me. So she was trying to say we want to tame globalisation. And this week she was at the globalisation HQ of Davos saying we want to be the champions of world trade open to the world. You know, it's a difficult message to try and convey.
It is indeed. Judge Parker, Beth Gardner, thank you both for joining us. We'll have to leave it there. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next, we'll be debating the Obama